This is chapter 13 in this third edition of the textbook. So sorry, I have chapter 14 on here because that must have been what it was called in one of the old editions. So we're going to go over the brain and some of the functions. There's a lot of information in this chapter. I'm going to try lots of anatomy. So we're going to try to narrow down the focus. So don't panic. Okay, so the first thing that I want to make sure you're okay with, and this was in the last chapter, was gray matter versus white matter. Okay, in the central nervous system, gray doesn't have myelin on it. Okay, so that is, if we draw an axon, well, in anything, gray doesn't have myelin on it. So if something is gray, there's no myelin. Okay, so if we look at this, okay, and there's my Bart-Simpson neuron. Okay, the parts that are gray, okay, it's going to be the dendrites in the cell body and the axon, or not the axon, the synaptic knob. Okay, the part that's going to be white, okay, is going to be the axon. Okay, now they have different names depending on the part. Okay, so if they're gray and they're in the central nervous system, okay, and they're on the surface of the brain or the surface of the spinal cord, we call them the cortex. Okay, if it's deep, we call them nuclei. Okay, if it's gray and it's in the peripheral nervous system, we call them ganglia, and that's plural. Ganglion would be singular. Okay, the white axons are called tracts when they're in the CNS, and we just call them nerves in the PNS. Okay, so they have different names depending on where they're located. It's important that you know what the gray matter is and what the white matter is. Okay, 4 main regions of the brain, and this is in lab, so this is kind of a review. Okay, so you're going to have cerebrum. I don't know why I didn't write it out, right? Cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. Okay, so cerebellum, back here, right? Cerebrum, it's up here, higher order thinking. Okay, diencephalon is in the middle. Okay, brainstem, I don't have another color. I thought I should have another color of this. Brainstem's down here. Okay, all right, so that's the basics. Okay, we're going to start from the outside of the brain. We're going to talk about the meninges. Okay, so the meninges are the stuff that's going to protect your brain. So if we go from the outside and work our way in, okay, we're going to have some things that are the layers, and then we're going to have spaces in between the layers. So the layers are the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. Okay, so you can think of it, dura mater we usually refer to as the tough mother. Okay, pia mater is the delicate mother. And the arachnoid matter is going to be the spider webby stuff in between. Okay, sub always means it's below something. Okay, so subdural space is below the dura mater. That makes sense, right? Subarachnoid space is below the arachnoid matter. Okay, so here's the skull, all right? And then the next layer, if we go in from the skull, we're gonna come across the dura mater. Okay, then we'll have a subdural space. Okay, then we're gonna come across the arachnoid matter, which is kind of the spider webby stuff. And then we'll have the subarachnoid space below that. And cerebral spinal fluid will be in there. Okay, and then we're going to come across the pia mater, which is laying right on top of the brain and touching it. And here you can see the cortex, which is on the outside surface, so the gray, and then you can start to see the white underneath of it. So I have them listed here in order from the outside in. So dura mater, when we cut it on a sheep brain, it's almost like a shrimp shell. Okay, now it is subdivided into 2 layers. So the outer layer is called the periosteal layer, and it's actually touching the skull, touching the bone. And then the inner layer is called the meningeal layer. Okay, now in the dura mater, we're going to have some sinuses, and they're called the dural venous sinuses. And they're going to collect blood that's circulated through the brain, and they're going to dump it back into the superior vena cava at some point so that the blood can recirculate. Okay, there are septum or septa that are formed where the dura mater come together. So it's kind of like folds in the dura mater. And this is in the lab. I know I assigned a lab that had labeling for these on it. Okay, now below the dura mater, we have the subdural space, right? And then we have the arachnoid mater and that subarachnoid space, and then the pia mater, which is actually areolar tissue, and it's just laying right on top of the brain. It looks kind of shiny on the brain. Okay, now sometimes we have, people can have a disorder of the meninges, which is called meningitis. So it's basically inflammation. The meninges are inflamed. So it can happen in little kids under 2, and sometimes it happens in people that are living in close proximity to each other, like in a military barracks or in a residence hall at college. Okay, now there's a couple different kinds of meningitis. There can be viral meningitis and there can be bacterial. So viral is usually the lesser of the 2, okay? What happens is people get a really, really bad headache, a sensitivity to light, a really stiff neck and fever, and they become drowsy. It's really hard to wake them up. It's diagnosed by going in and with a lumbar puncture. So they'll go into the lower back and into the arachnoid space and remove some cerebral spinal fluid. And then they'll culture the cerebral spinal fluid and look to see if bacteria are growing in it, or they might do a test on it, like a PCR on it, to look for the virus that could cause meningitis. Okay, now in the brain, there are spaces or cavities in it. So if you could take a brain and you could fill it up, like dump plaster into it, what you would see after you peeled the brain away are these things, this blue space. Okay, so there are cavities in the brain. They're lined with microglial cells, remember ependymal cells, and they're actually filled with CSF. And we're going to talk about CSF here in a minute. So CSF is cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, this is also a lab thing. Okay, so the ventricles have cerebral spinal fluid in them. There are 2 lateral ventricles, a right and a left, but usually we just call it the lateral ventricle, okay, or lateral ventricle. So it's this up here, that big thing. Okay, and they're connected. Okay, and then the 3rd ventricle is down here. And then there's this thing that's called the cerebral aqueduct, and it flows down to the 4th ventricle. Okay. Cerebral spinal fluid is a clear, colorless fluid. We make about 500 milliliters a day, and it's made from blood. Okay. We make it from choroid plexus, so there's modified capillaries, and they kind of serve as a filter. So blood cells and proteins, things that are kind of big, stay in the blood, but things that are smaller can pass through the choroid plexus and become part of the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid, hopefully you never have to see it, but if someone has a traumatic head injury, cerebral spinal fluid can come out the ears. Okay, and it's kind of has like a rainbowy, like when it rains and there's oil on the road and you see that rainbow iridescent color, that's kind of what it looks like. Okay, now, cerebral spinal fluid is going to be in the subarachnoid space around the brain and in the ventricles. Okay, so let me show you this. Okay, so here's how it flows. Okay, so these little red things here, these are supposed to be choroid plexus. So these are modified capillaries. So blood is going into them. Cerebral spinal fluid is going to come out, but the blood will continue to circulate. Okay, so there'll just be fluid in here. So if we start here, number one, CSF is secreted by the choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle. And then it goes through this little space here, which is called the interventricular foramina. Okay, and that'll go into the third ventricle. So in every ventricle, there's choroid plexus, and that choroid plexus is going to dump more CSF into it. Okay, so then the cerebral spinal fluid is going to go down through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. Okay, then it'll flow out. There are lateral apertures and there's a medial aperture. Okay, so those are basically just little holes. So the fluid will flow out. It'll go around the brain. Okay, in the subarachnoid layer, it can go down the central canal and the spinal cord, and it'll go around and protect the spinal cord. Okay, so it's providing this barrier, this cushiony barrier. It's going to help protect your brain. Okay, now, if you're making this fluid all the time, it needs to have some place to go when you're finished with it. Okay, you can't just keep making it or the things are going to swell up. And if you actually are an adult, your skull is fused, so there's no place for the fluid to go if it does swell up. Okay, so the idea is we have these things that are called arachnoid villi. So the arachnoid villi are little fingers that go into these dural sinuses, and they're going to allow the excess cerebral spinal fluid to get reabsorbed into the bloodstream. Okay, so why do we have cerebral spinal fluid? Okay, so one thing it does is it gives your brain neutral buoyancy. So it's kind of floating it in your skull. Okay, it's going to protect your brain from hitting the rough edges of your skull. It's also going to chemically protect your brain. Okay, so it's going to remove waste that's building up. Okay, it's going to return to the blood with the arachnoid villi. Okay, if those get clogged up, you can have problems, but they can be fixed. Okay, now another thing to talk about is the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so your brain is receiving a lot of blood. It needs a lot of blood in order to stay alive. So we have to protect it. So the way that we're going to protect it is we're going to protect it by having some capillaries. So the modified, sorry, my phone's ringing. Modified capillaries have super tight junctions. So there's no space in between them for things to get through. Okay, the blood-brain barrier is going to regulate glucose, ions, and proteins. Okay, if something is lipid soluble, it can go through the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so things like alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, some pain stuff, it can go through the blood-brain barrier. Some drugs destroy the blood-brain barrier and get in. Okay, now, the blood-brain barrier is not absolute. There are exceptions to it. So those exceptions are the choroid plexus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. Okay, so now if you think about this, this makes perfect sense, right? Because this is a capillary. Okay, the hypothalamus and the pineal glands are the endocrine, part of the endocrine system. So they're dumping things into the blood. So there's a way to get from them into the blood, right? These exceptions can allow a way for things to get past the blood-brain barrier. So one example is that HIV can get through here and get into the brain. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to start at the parts of the brain, and we're going to work our way up and talk about the anatomy and the function. Okay, there is a lot of information in the text, so I'll try to narrow it down. Okay, and this picture is not good. Okay, so the first thing is the medulla oblongata, and it's actually down here. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is the most inferior structure of the brain. Okay, the big things that I want you to know about it, okay, is this is where these important centers are. And you guys can read these. So there's a cardiac center. So it's going to control how fast your heart's beating and how strong it's beating. Vasomotor center is going to help control blood pressure. Okay, it's going to control the respiratory center. Okay, so how deep are you breathing? How fast are you breathing? Okay, so these are vital functions. So the brainstem is super duper important. If the brainstem goes out, you're in deep trouble. Okay, it also has some non-vital reflex centers, so like gagging and stuff like that. Okay, now there are tracks that go through the medulla oblongata. Things cross here, and they call that the decussation of the pyramids. So basically what that means is information coming from the left side of your body goes to the right side of your brain, and things going from the left side of your body go to the right side of your brain. Okay, I'm not worried that you memorize these, right? I just kind of want you to get this. This is really important. Okay, now the pons. The pons is the bump. I always think of the O and pons and the O. That looks like a big bump. Okay, now the big things about the pons, okay, is it's taking information to the thalamus. Okay, so information is going up through it and back down through it. Okay, and it is going to help regulate respiration. Okay, there's other stuff in there, but that's one thing I want you to get right now. Okay, now if we go up higher, okay, and we're going through the midbrain, right? And we're kind of taking a cross section. You're going to see some internal nuclei in here. Okay, so one of the internal nuclei that you see is called the substantia nigra. Oops. Substantia nigra. What it does is it's going to help control skeletal movement. Okay, and make it easier for you to walk smoothly. Okay, it also has the red nucleus, okay, which allows you to have fine motor control. And then the central gray matter, which is going to help you be aware of pain. Okay, now, in this, okay, we also have this thing called the corpora quadrigemina. So the corpora quadrigemina is made up of two things. So the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Okay, so here's the superior one. Okay, and I'll show you on another picture. These are going to have to do with your reflex response to a flash of light or a loud noise. So it's like going to protect you if somebody pops a flash in your face, or if they drop a book and you snap back. That's what those do. Okay, now cerebellum. So this is your cerebellum. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. I'm happy, no cerebellum. Okay, the white matter in the cerebellum is actually called the arbor vitae. Okay, so the tree of life. So those would be tracks. Okay, and then there's gray matter all around it. Okay, now if you look here, this is the fourth ventricle. Okay, there's the pons. There's medulla oblongata. Up here's the midbrain. Okay, now the cerebellum, what it's going to do is it's going to integrate sensory information from receptors in your body, and that's going to help you control your skeletal muscle movement and keep you upright and balanced. Okay, so it's taking information that's coming in about where you are in space and helping you control your body so you don't fall over. Okay, it's also going to send a message to the cerebrum. Okay, and that's going to help you figure out where you actually are. Okay, so this, I always say my cerebellum must be really small because I'm not very coordinated. I can't like run and catch a ball and stuff like that. Okay, so cerebellum has to do with skeletal muscle movement and keeping it straight and knowing where you are and being aware. Okay, so here's the colliculi. So the superior and the inferior colliculi. So they're part of this thing called the tectum, and we also call it the corpora quadrigemina. Okay, so they are right here. These little things, they're 4 little balls. So if you look, corpora would be body, and quad is 4, and 4 little gems, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the superior colliculi are a response to visual stimulus, and then the inferior has to do with if it's a loud noise. Okay, now there is a group of nuclei, okay, so gray matter, that's in your brainstem. And instead of learning what each one of them is going to be called, we're going to call it the reticular formation or the reticular activating system, the RAS. Okay, now what they do collectively is all of these things that I have listed on here. Okay, so they're going to regulate your balance and your posture. Okay, so it allows you to track things that are running across in front of you. Okay, they have the cardiac, okay, so your heart rate and your blood pressure centers. They're going to determine whether the pain is worthy enough to go to your brain. So pain modulation. And then they also regulate sleep and conscious attention. Okay, so basically, this is the stuff that's going to try to keep you aware of where you are and what's going on around you, and they're going to help keep you alive. Okay, if these nuclei are damaged, okay, it can lead to a coma. So you don't know what's going on, and you can't send that information to the cortex of your brain. So barbiturates, okay, are going to suppress that. So it's going to put you into like a funk where you can't determine what is actually going on. Okay, now we want to talk about the thalamus. So the thalamus is this little part of your brain, and I'm missing having you guys for lab face-to-face. Okay, I'm going to show you on here. So here is a mid-sagittal head, and in the middle, right here, let's try to do it like this. In the middle right here, this is the thalamus. Okay, down below it, that's the hypothalamus. Okay, so if you could dissect the thalamus out, okay, this is what it looks like, but it's in the middle of your brain. Okay, the way that the thalamus works, I always explain it like a good secretary. Okay, so a really good secretary, what it's going to do is it's going to take the information that's coming up your spinal cord and to your brainstem, and it's going to determine how you need to respond. Okay, so it's going to integrate and direct information to the appropriate area in your cerebrum. Okay, so all sensory information that's on the way to the cerebral cortex has to go through the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to try to figure out if it can be taken, where it needs to be taken care of, and if it even needs to go to the brain. Okay, now it also takes care of some motor control. So it's going to take information from the cerebrum and send it to the cerebellum so you can figure out where you need to go. Okay, it's also involved in the limbic system. Okay, so the limbic system is a group of structures that has to do with memory and emotion and how certain memories make you feel. Okay, so the hypothalamus keeps you happy. So it's the most important part of your brain for regulating homeostasis. Okay, so it's master control of the endocrine system. Okay, so it's going to control autonomic nervous system. It's going to control help regulate emotional behavior. So all of these things that are listed here, and you guys can read them, are going to be regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay, so are you hot? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are you sleeping? Can you remember? And a libido, okay, sex drive. Okay, now another part of the diencephalon is some places call it the epithalamus, okay? But we've been learning it as the pineal gland, okay? And you guys know that this releases melatonin. Okay, so it's going to help regulate your circadian rhythms. Okay, now if we go through the cerebrum, the parts of the cerebrum. Okay, so the big thing is this is the central sulcus. Okay, so I didn't talk about the sulcus and the gyrus because I always do that in lab. So a sulcus is an indentation in the brain, and the gyrus is the raised part of the brain. Okay, so where it's going down, that would be a sulcus. Where it's going up, that would be a gyrus. Okay, now the central sulcus is going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus is on the side, okay, and it's going to separate the front and the top from the temporal lobe. Okay, now they've named the gyrus before the sulcus, the central sulcus, and after the central sulcus. Okay, so there's a pre-central gyrus and a post-central gyrus. Okay, now if we go over the lobes of the brain here, okay, so frontal is in the front, parietal is kind of like in the top, occipital is in the back, and temporal lobe is on the side. Okay, now the cerebral cortex, okay, so that's the gray matter, has lots of folds, okay, and the folds increase the surface area. Okay, so the more folds you have, the smarter you are. Okay, now the functions of the lobes. Okay, so the frontal has motor areas. It has your higher decision making, so higher intellectual functions. It's where your personality originates, and it has verbal communication. So are you able to speak clearly? Which sometimes making these videos, I don't feel that way. Okay, now the parietal is on the top. And it has general sensory info coming in from the skin to it. It's also going to help us interpret what people are saying and what we're reading. Okay, occipital is going to take the visual information in, and that's where you're going to take the information in and interpret it. Okay, temporal is auditory, so hearing, olfactory, what you're smelling, and written and spoken language. Okay, and then the insula, which you can't see on this picture, the insula is deep inside the brain, and it has to do with taste. Okay, now, in the cerebrum, okay, we have white matter. Okay, now the white matter, remember, they're called tracts. Okay, so most of the cerebrum is going to be white. Okay, now there's like one track I want you to know, and that's corpus callosum. Okay, now there's 3 categories of tracks, okay, and that's based on where they're taking their information. So there are projection tracks, so they're taking the information from the brain to the spinal cord. There are commissural tracks, which are going between hemispheres of the brain, and then there are association tracks. Okay, so projection tracks are going up and down. So if we look here, let me try to highlight it, maybe. Projection tracks are going up and down. That's supposed to be projection track. Okay. Commissural tracks are going to do 2 sides. Okay, so this corpus callosum is going to connect the right and the left half together. Okay, and then association tracks are connecting lobes. They are connecting information within lobes. Okay, so here's association tract. So this is in the parietal lobe, and there's the occipital lobe. So it's taking information from the parietal lobe and taking it to the occipital lobe, or they're connecting things from the temporal lobe to the occipital lobe. Okay, so it's like connecting the lobes together. Okay, you don't have to memorize the names of the tracks. I just want you to know these 3 things. Okay, now basal nuclei. Okay, so this is gray matter that's deep inside the brain. I'm not going to have you memorize all of them, okay, what they are called. I just want you to know that they deal with helping us integrate things that we do without necessarily thinking about it, like things like walking, right? So you might get started walking, but then your body keeps it going. Okay, or swimming or laughing. So things that once you get tying your shoes, right? Once you get them started, it just keeps going. Okay, so those are your basal nuclei. Okay, now the limbic system. The limbic system is kind of cool because it's how you remember things. Okay, so it's this loop of structures, and it's in this, they're highlighted in this kind of teal color. Okay, and what they have to do with is they have to do with memory and emotion and gratification and diversion. Okay, so I always think about, like, if somebody says, oh, when I smell chocolate chip cookies, it makes me think of my grandmother, right? So that's basically what the limbic system does. So the limbic system is made up of the fornix, okay, this gyrate, cingulate gyrus, okay, the hippocampus. Okay, so it's made up of these parts. Okay, now cognition. So cognition is how you think and how you think about thinking. Okay, so there are association areas associated with each of our senses. And what they're going to do is they're going to take information from the senses and they're going to help you interpret it and maybe apply meaning to it. So the parietal lobe has to do with with overall senses on your body, right? Like whether you can feel your body, your somatic senses. Okay, so touch. Okay, so there is a thing that if the parietal lobe or the association area is damaged, that is called contralateral neglect syndrome. So this is when people forget that they might have the other half of their body. So they're shaving and washing one side of the body, but the other side, they don't know that it's there. The temporal lobe has to do with language. Okay, so agnosia or I always say this wrong. These have to do with you might not recognize faces, or you might not be able to put a name with the face, or maybe an object, and you might not know that you see the cup, but you don't know that it's a cup, and you don't know what it's for. Okay, and then the frontal lobe damage to it has to do with personality disorders or personality, and like being able to plan and figure out what you need to do next and how to execute appropriate behavior. Okay, so a lot of the things that they've learned about the brain and the function of the brain, they figured out because someone's damaged part of their brain. So one example of that that's been used a lot is the accidental lobotomy of Phineas Gage. Okay, so Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who was like a really good employee, worked really hard, knew what he was doing, and like a crowbar, they were tamping down dynamite or something, and a crowbar accidentally went through his face and his brain, and it gave him a frontal lobotomy. Okay, so he lost both of his frontal lobes, and his personality totally changed. So he lost his ability to plan. He lost his ability to, I mean, he didn't die, right? But he just couldn't, his personality totally changed, right? He didn't show up to work on time, and he couldn't carry out his responsibilities. Okay, now memory, okay, whenever you're learning something, okay, so the book says information management, okay, so it requires us learning it, right? It requires us remembering it, but it also requires us forgetting things that aren't necessarily important and hanging on to the things that are important. Okay, so if we have problems with memory, okay, there's two things that can happen. So one is called anterograde amnesia. And well, there's more than two things that can happen, but here are two things that could happen. So there's anterograde amnesia and there's retrograde amnesia. So in 51st Dates, she had anterograde amnesia. So she couldn't make no new memories, right? So every day was a new day for her, right? Now, retrograde amnesia means you can't remember things from the past. So no past memories, right? Because it's retro. Okay, now I wrote these things on here. Hippocampus. I'm trying to remember what I was thinking when I did this. I hate when I do stuff and then I can't remember. So I have hippocampus, cerebellum, and the amygdala on here. So the hippocampus and the amygdala are part of, here's language. I'm looking in the book to see if I can remember what I was thinking. Memory. I don't know what I was trying to get you guys to think about here, but it's okay. Don't worry about this too much. I don't remember what I was trying to say, so it must not have been too important. When I look at memory, the part of memory in the textbook, it's not anything in there. So this is fine. Okay, now emotion. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex, so the very front of our brain, is the seat of judgment. So emotions form in the hypothalamus and the amygdala. So they've done all sorts of crazy things with animals, right? So artificial stimulation in the hypothalamus and the amygdala can cause, depending on where they put it, they can produce fear. They can produce all these emotions. They can produce fear, anger, pleasure. Okay, so they can stimulate like a rat is licking its baby and it feels like something's happening. So that's how they try to figure out what how emotions work. So most of our behavior is learned by positive or negative responses from other people. Okay, now sensory perception. Okay, so we'll talk about senses in a couple chapters, but the idea is that receptors in our body, okay, are going to take whatever the stimulus is and they're going to make it a neural signal and they're going to send it to the brain where the brain figures out what we're going to do next. Okay, so sensory functions we divide into two big categories. So one is somaesthetic sensation and the other is the special senses. Okay, so somaesthetic, we always think body. Okay, so this is overall touch, right? And then the special senses are things like in your head, right? That not in your head, but that are occurring in your cranium. Okay, so eyes, like visual, hearing, taste, smell. Okay, so those are considered special, while the others are more general. Okay, so somaesthetic signals are going to go up your spinal cord into your brainstem and then to your thalamus. And then your thalamus is going to send them to your post-central gyrus. So that's the somatosensory area. Okay, so it's going to the back of your brain. Okay, and then from there, it's going to go, so the primary somaesthetic area is right here, right? This post-central gyrus. Okay, now the special senses are going to go to other places in your brain. Okay, so taste is going to the parietal lobe. Auditory is going to the temporal lobe. Okay, olfactory is up here in the frontal. Okay, the visual stuff all goes to the occipital lobe. Okay, so there is a big picture in your book. And actually, to me, it's kind of overwhelming because there's just so much information in it. But it shows you the lobes of the brain and their functional areas. Okay, the association areas, the functional brain regions, and the sensory areas. Okay, so you should know that in general, and I'll make you guys a study guide to try to help you pinpoint it. Okay, so now what an association area does is it's going to help you process and interpret the information. So the somaesthetic association area is going to take the information that's coming from where you're being touched and it's going to help you determine what you should do to it. Like, is it a fly? Should you swat it away? Are you getting hurt? Do you need to move? How do you respond to it? Okay, the visual association is going to help you interpret what you see. Auditory is going to help you interpret what you hear. Okay, now motor control is going to take place and get initiated from the front of your brain. Okay, so it's going to initiate in the precentral gyrus. Okay, so sensory's coming in the back door, but motor control is going out the front door. Okay, so the intention to contract a muscle begins in the premotor area of the frontal lobe. Okay, the precentral gyrus processes that information. It's going to send it down the spinal cord. Okay, the upper motor neurons are more superior, which we'll talk about as we get further along. Okay, and things are going to occur contralaterally. Okay, so contralaterally means what's coming from the right side of your brain is going to control what's on the left, and what's coming from the left is going to control what's on the right. Sometimes, most of the time. Okay, now here is cerebral functions, and when they say somebody's right-brained or left-brained, okay, here's just a big picture that has everything listed. But on here, okay, so right hemisphere is on the patient's right side, and the left is on the left side. Okay, and this sulcus is what's dividing them. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so if the left brain is considered categorical. Okay, so look here. So left brain is things like rational symbolic thought, superior language comprehension, verbal memory. Okay, then if you look at the right side has things like feeling shapes with the left hand, memory for shapes, musical ability, whether you can hear non-vocal sounds, intuitive nonverbal thought, faces and spatial relationships. Okay, so basically we say the left is like, if you're left brain, right, that's like your math and science in theory. And then the right brain is going to be like the art part. Okay, they say that it's highly correlated with handedness. I don't know about all this. Lateralization develops more as we age. So if you're little and there's a problem with the communication between the right and left hemisphere, or something happens to a hemisphere, the other hemisphere will compensate. They say males have more problems if there is trauma, because in females, the part that connects the right and left halves, the corpus callosum that's connecting the two halves, is thicker, is bigger. So women, or they say like women can multitask better because the two hemispheres are connected by a bigger tract compared to men. Okay, so they might be able to think with the right brain or their left brain, but they might have a hard time relaying the information back and forth. Okay, so wait a minute, I have repeated the same slide again. And that's all I have for this. Sorry, guys. I have the same slide over and over again. I don't know why it does that.